Number 14. The gun that shot around corners. The rifle fires before the soldier appears. A helmet stays hidden behind a shattered brick wall, while a burst of 7.92mm rounds tears across the alley at an impossible angle. The weapon is an STG-44, but its barrel does not point toward the target. It bends, roughly 30 degrees, like machinery built for a fight where normal sight lines no longer mattered. Through a periscope sight, an infantryman could aim around cover without exposing his head. A tank crew could sweep the ground beside an armored vehicle while staying behind steel. It addressed a terrifying problem. It also tore itself apart trying to do it. In practice, bullets deformed, accuracy collapsed, and the barrel rapidly destroyed itself. This weapon was hidden behind cover not because it was useless, but because it pointed to a battlefield where survival depended on firing from places no enemy could see. It was a rifle built to strip cover of its safety. In early 1945, German infantry were being pushed into the kind of fighting where a wall could mean the difference between life and death. Cities turned every corner into a firing position. A man could press his back against broken masonry, see nothing but brick and dust, and still know someone was waiting on the other side. Walls created blind spots. Trenches did too. So did the armored hull of a tank. The solution began with the STG-44, Germany's new selective-fire assault rifle, chambered for the compact 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge. It could fire semi-automatically or in bursts, and its standard magazine held 30 rounds. The rifle still obeyed one old rule. The barrel had to point where the shooter wanted the bullet to go. The Krummlauf was an attempt to break that rule. Engineers fitted a curved extension onto the muzzle. The common infantry version bent the bullet's path about 30 degrees. A soldier could lie flat behind a wall, bring the weapon close to the edge, and look through the Winkelzielfernrohr WZF-5811, a small periscope-style sight mounted above the rifle. His head stayed behind cover. The sight looked around the corner. The barrel followed. Beyond the wall, the enemy could be hit by a shooter he could not see. The concept was simple. Getting a bullet through the turn was not. A normal rifle barrel guides a projectile through a straight steel tube. The Krummlauf forced that projectile along a curve. The bullet scraped against the inside of the attachment, twisted under pressure, and came out with its shape, and often its accuracy, already damaged. Designers drilled gas relief holes into some versions to bleed off pressure. That reduced stress, but it did not make the system gentle. The extension wore rapidly. Bullets could deform. Groups opened up. The weapon might point around a corner, but the projectile no longer behaved like a precise rifle round. At short distance, that might be enough. The purpose was not to place one perfect shot through a window. It was to sweep a dangerous space while keeping the shooter hidden. The same mechanism was meant for something larger than street fighting. Tank crews feared soldiers carrying explosives into the dead ground beside their vehicles. Cover was strongest where it was thickest, but a tank could not see every patch of earth around itself. Enemy infantry could crawl close, disappear beneath the gun's line of sight, and attack from a position the crew could not reach. So another Krummlauf version was developed for armored vehicles. It was intended to fire through ports or ball mounts, allowing the crew to direct fire into the close-in blind zone without opening the vehicle and exposing themselves. Now the rifle was not just shooting around a wall, it was turning the tank's blind side into a killing zone. That mattered because the weapon was built for a war Germany was already losing. The problem was real, but time was not on its side. The STG-44 entered mass issue under its final designation in 1944. The curved attachment appeared as German forces were being pushed into defensive battles, trapped by collapsing supply lines and improvised positions. There was no comfortable development cycle. No long stretch to refine the design, train every unit, and find out which claims survived combat. Rheinmetall Borsig tested attachment and sight mounts to as many as 5,000 rounds in operational condition. Even that did not answer how long the curved barrel could remain useful in the field. The geometry was too unforgiving. Every burst punished the metal. Every shot brought the weapon closer to failure. The combat record remains frustratingly incomplete. Captured examples were examined by U.S. troops in 1945 after Germany's collapse. British and American personnel photographed and demonstrated the devices. The objects survived clearly enough to prove the concept was real. What remains unclear is how many were actually fielded and how often soldiers trusted them in battle. That uncertainty suits the weapon. It looked like a secret weapon, but not because it was invisible. Its weaknesses were right out in the open. The bent tube, the awkward sight, the ruined bullets, the short life of the attachment. Still, behind a shattered wall, it could work exactly as intended. You see only brick. The shooter peers through a periscope. The rifle points away from you, but the muzzle is already aimed past the corner. Then the curve starts destroying itself. The bullets deform inside the barrel. Accuracy collapses. The attachment wears out under the pressure of its own trick. The rifle really could shoot around corners, but only by turning its barrel into a part that its own ammunition was constantly tearing apart. Number 13. The crawling bomb. They laughed first. In April 1944, near the Anzio beachhead, an American infantryman named Audie Murphy watched one of the strangest machines of the war creep out from German cover. It was low to the ground, little more than a steel box on tracks, so small that men compared it to a toy. No driver, no turret, no visible crew, just a stubby shape bumping through the dirt at a pace barely faster than a walking man. Soldiers could mock it while bullets still passed overhead. A wire ran from the joke. A 3-strand control cable unspooled from the rear of the machine and stretched across the ground toward a German operator hidden under cover. He steered from safety while the vehicle did the dying for him. Germany began producing the first electric version, the SDKFZ-302, in April 1942. It carried about 60 kilograms of explosive inside a body barely larger than a handcart. Later gasoline versions, the 303A and 303B, carried 75, then 100 kilograms. It was not a scout or a supply carrier. It was a disposable bomb with tracks. The design answered part of a question hanging over many of these weapons. Some machines disappeared because they failed before they mattered. Others stayed out of sight because they worked in ways that made war feel less human and more mechanical. The Goliath occupied the narrow space between ridicule and fear. Both could appear within the same 10 seconds. At Anzio, men noticed its size first. Then they saw where it was going. It crawled toward obstacles that would have pinned a sapper down and killed him. Tank traps, bunkers, barricades, and minefields. The idea was brutally simple. Keep the engineer alive. The machine instead. Detonate it when it reached the target. The operator stayed behind cover while the little carrier crossed the killing zone alone. You can see why soldiers laughed. The laughter ended when the machine kept moving. By the middle of 1944, Allied intelligence knew Germany was using remote-controlled demolition vehicles. Reports described them in July. The weapon was not unknown. It was hidden in the way a tripwire is hidden. You did not need to miss the object. You only needed to realize too late that the man trying to kill you was nowhere near it. The machine looked absurdly vulnerable. Its top speed was just over 6 kilometers per hour. Its ground clearance was about 11.4 centimeters. In a clean field, that was one thing. In battle, mud, craters, loose brick, shell holes, and broken curbstones could stop it cold. Rifle fire could damage the hull. Shell fragments could cut the cable. A sharp turn through rubble could snag the wire and leave the vehicle blind and useless in the street. The tiny tank that caused real deaths was not terrifying because it was unstoppable. It was terrifying because it kept threatening to work anyway. Thousands were built. Around 4,929 of the gasoline-powered 303 series alone. Common totals for all Goliath types reached 7,564. Those are not prototype numbers. They show that German planners kept feeding steel, engines, batteries, and explosives into the concept while the war was already starving for all of them. Battle kept exposing the cost. At Normandy later that same year, the same weaknesses followed the machine ashore. A vehicle that small could approach under fire more safely than a man, but only if the ground cooperated. Real ground did not. A shallow crater became a wall. A chunk of masonry became a ramp the Goliath could not climb. One burst of infantry fire might miss the hull and still sever the cable. When that happened, the Goliath did not become a roaming nightmare. It became a box of expensive explosives sitting useless between the lines. Its memory lasted for a different reason. In cities where barricades narrowed the streets and collapsed buildings filled the road, the machine fit the logic of siege warfare. During the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, German remote demolition carriers were used against barricades and structures, turning short stretches of street into engineered death zones. The record needs care here. The famous Kilinsky Street explosion on August 13th is often blamed on a Goliath online, but some accounts identify the vehicle as a larger Borgward 4, not the smaller Goliath. The distinction matters because late-war German demolition systems have blurred together in memory. The scene they left behind has not. A machine came forward. Men crowded around it, fired at it, or failed to stop it. Then a section of street became a blast chamber. The Goliath's place in the war was not as a wonder weapon or a joke. It made distance itself feel lethal. The operator was somewhere else. The charge was coming toward you. Its small size often triggered the wrong emotion first. You were in a slit trench or behind a shattered wall. The machine appears at ground level, bumping over debris, almost silly in its proportions. Someone grins. Someone points. Just over walking speed, it does not look like death should move like that. Then someone spots the wire dragging behind it. Someone shouts to cut the cable. The little carrier keeps coming, bouncing over the dirt. It is close enough now for the steel hull to fill your whole field of view. Inside the later version was 100 kilograms of explosive. The laughter ended there. Number 12. The spring-loaded tank killer. The anti-tank weapon that punished the man brave enough to use it. On the night of October 21st to 22nd, 1944, Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith crossed into a fragile bridgehead near the Savio River in northern Italy. He was with the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, carrying a weapon that looked less like a modern launcher than a metal argument assembled in a workshop. The British Projector Infantry Anti-Tank was only about 97 centimeters long, but it weighed heavily in the hands. It used no rocket motor, no launch tube full of propellant, no bright trail racing across the battlefield. Instead, a massive spring drove a bomb forward from a central spigot. The idea sounded simple. Operating it was not. The PIAT had to throw a shaped charge projectile hard enough to punch through armored steel. The energy came from a spring the operator had to cock manually. Before combat, that meant bracing the weapon against the ground, pulling the body apart, and forcing the mechanism into firing position. In a quiet room, it was unpleasant. Under fire, it could become a separate battle. Soldiers could carry a PIAT into position, see German armor approaching, and still struggle to make it ready. The machine was compact enough to hide, but its spring demanded a brutal payment before the first shot. It punished hesitation and weak footing. A man could discover, at the worst possible moment, that the weapon was not cocked. The numbers explain why armies tolerated the design. The PIAT could fire a shaped charge bomb against armored vehicles and fortified positions without the backblast of a conventional rocket launcher. Bazooka announced itself with flame, smoke, and a blast that could tear through a cramped room or ignite anything behind the operator. The PIAT did not. It could be fired from a doorway, a ditch, or the broken interior of a building. No rocket plume rose behind the soldier. No glowing signature told every rifleman where the shot had come from. The price was distance. Smith moved his PIAT across open ground as German armor came dangerously close. At roughly 10 meters, he fired. The bomb struck and disabled an enemy vehicle. 10 meters. That was close enough to see the tracks grinding through the mud and hear the engine before the explosion. Missing did not leave Smith safely out of the fight. It left the tank looking directly at him. He did not withdraw after the hit. He held the road with a Tommy gun while protecting a wounded comrade, as German tanks, self-propelled guns, a staff car, and infantry pushed into the bridgehead. The PIAT had turned one infantryman in a ditch into an ambush weapon. The spring still had to be ready before the armor arrived. Its lack of backblast made concealment possible. The operator could wait until the target entered killing range. That same closeness made preparation dangerous. The weapon had to be ready before the moment of courage. After firing, the PIAT's recoil was designed to help reset the mechanism. In theory, the projectile's movement and the spring system prepared the launcher for another shot. In practice, a failed self-cocking cycle could leave the operator wrestling with the heavy mechanism while the enemy was still moving. There was no elegant reload. There was a man, a spring, a bomb, and armor closing the distance. Same brutal logic appeared at Arnhem. On September 19, 1944, Major Robert Henry Kane used a PIAT against German armor during the fighting there. His Victoria Cross citation, published in the London Gazette on November 2nd, recorded a weapon that demanded extraordinary nerve. It had to be brought close to the target and fired from cover, or from whatever ground still existed around the soldier. The German tank crew feared the invisible ambush. The Allied soldier feared the mechanism. The PIAT was not hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because it made no spectacle. No long-range streak, no dramatic engine noise. Only a shaped charge bomb appearing from a doorway at the distance where survival became a matter of seconds. Smith's shot worked because he accepted that distance. The spring made the weapon possible, but it could also kill him before the first round left the spigot. Then the mechanism reset, or failed to, and the decision began again in the smoke beside the road. When the armor finally came close, the PIAT was not a distant solution. It was a heavy spring being forced into place by a man whose hands were already shaking. Number 11. The Invisible Spear. Just before midnight on November 30th, 1942, in the black water off Tassafaronga Point, American cruisers began taking hits from a direction that made no sense. Radar had found the Japanese first. The guns had opened first. One destroyer, Takanami, was already burning. Minutes later, USS Minneapolis was torn open forward. USS New Orleans lost her bow. USS Pensacola was hit. USS Northampton would sink into Iron Bottom Sound. The crews were fighting what they could see. The weapon killing them had been fired from a range they did not believe was possible. A torpedo had just killed from outside the map the American bridge crews were using. Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright believed he had the advantage because radar had given him the contact. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's force was there to deliver supplies to Guadalcanal, not to seek a set-piece gun battle. The American side seemed to have the cleaner opening. Night combat punished that assumption. Takanami was hit hard, making the first exchange look familiar. Find the enemy, fire first, force him into the darkness. As Tanaka's remaining destroyers turned, they launched the weapon that mattered. It was not an exotic idea or a miracle shell. It was a 24-inch torpedo, 610 millimeters across, already running silently through the channel while American ships remained focused on muzzle flashes. The American belief was simple. Japanese ships could not launch effectively from that far away. Not at speed, not at night, not with enough accuracy to tear through a cruiser line minutes later. At Tassafaronga, that belief met the water. Officers saw the Japanese turn away and assumed the danger was receding. Destroyers had already fired Type 93 torpedoes, the oxygen-fueled weapon later nicknamed the Long Lance. The torpedoes were still moving across distances the American crews did not consider real. The immediate danger was not only that the range had been underestimated, it was that the entire cruiser formation kept maneuvering as if the first impact had been an isolated surprise. The same false range model continued exposing ships that believed they were moving away from danger. The Type 93 could run at about 52 knots and travel roughly 22,000 meters at high speed, carrying a warhead of approximately 490 kilograms. Those numbers changed the geometry of the encounter. A ship that appeared outside the launch envelope was still inside it. A turn that looked like retreat could be the moment of attack. A dark patch of ocean that seemed empty could already contain something moving fast enough to arrive before anyone had redrawn the map. The weapon was difficult to see for a second reason. Most torpedoes of the era advertised themselves. Compressed air systems left a visible wake, a line of disturbance on the surface that could be spotted, followed, and feared. The Type 93 used pure oxygen as its oxidizer. That made it dangerous to handle aboard ship, especially when destroyers carried reloads and exposed stored weapons to battle damage. A fire or hit among those torpedoes could threaten the Japanese ship that had launched them. But the same system let the weapon burn more cleanly and leave a much smaller bubble trail. The weapon was hidden twice, first by darkness, then by physics. Sailors searched for the sign they expected. Often they saw nothing. Failure was not only a failure of information. In 1940, a source in Tokyo warned the U.S. naval attaché about Japan's oxygen torpedo. The report reached American ordnance officials. They dismissed it as implausible and too dangerous. In one sense, they were right. The torpedo was dangerous to build, dangerous to store, and dangerous to carry with reloads on a destroyer that might be hit. But caution hardened into disbelief. A weapon does not need to be invisible if the enemy has already decided it cannot exist. At Tassafaranga, that blind spot became fleet-level shock within minutes. Minneapolis was struck first, her bow wrecked. New Orleans suffered one of the most grotesque cruiser injuries of the war. The entire bow was blown off ahead of turret 2. Pensacola tried to maneuver through the chaos. A torpedo hit her, and the cruiser burned fiercely. Northampton took torpedoes and later went down. 1 U.S. heavy cruiser was sunk. 3 more were heavily damaged. Tanaka's mission was supply delivery under pressure. The result was an astonishing reversal. For the Americans, it was more than a defeat. The visible sequence and the actual sequence did not match. The guns said one thing, the damage said another. You can feel the terror on a cruiser bridge after midnight. You know where the enemy was a few minutes earlier. You know your ships fired first. You know one Japanese destroyer is burning. Then steel folds open below the forecastle. A bow disappears. The impact arrives without a clear cause. The explanation exists. It was already in the sea. But 2 years earlier, that explanation had been rejected in an office. The Type 93 was designed in 1928. The war, it had become the first fully oxygen-fueled surface ship torpedo fielded at scale. It was not magic. It was exactingly engineered and extremely hazardous, a weapon capable of punishing its own side if mishandled. Its danger, therefore, ran in both directions. Japanese crews had to launch and carry it without losing their own ship, while American crews had to recognize a threat their doctrine had placed beyond reach. At Guadalcanal, American commanders repeatedly misread Japanese surface tactics because the torpedo's real performance exceeded their accepted limits. Japanese ships were not merely hiding in darkness. They were firing from beyond the enemy's mental horizon, and the American formation could remain exposed even after the first cruiser was hit. Officially, the night action off Tassafaranga could be described as a radar-equipped American force surprising Japanese destroyers and damaging Takanami. On the water, the sequence was different. Destroyers turning away launched oxygen torpedoes that could run about 22,000 meters at 52 knots with almost no visible wake. 4 U.S. cruisers paid for the difference between what American officers believed was plausible and what was already moving through the sea. And if that belief survived the battle, future night formations could still be steering into the same unseen range. Number 10. The siege gun too big to hide. In early June 1942, German engineers opened a rail position north of Sevastopol and prepared a cannon that could not simply be driven to the front. Schwerer Gustav arrived as a moving construction project. Parallel tracks, curved rail for aiming, heavy cranes, ammunition cars, security troops, and hundreds of workers had to turn a piece of railway into a firing platform. Every meter of preparation announced that something extraordinary was being built there. Krupp had designed the weapon in Essen for a different war. In 1936, Adolf Hitler visited the company and demanded guns powerful enough to break the French Maginot Line. Krupp answered with an 800mm railway gun, its barrel nearly 32 inches across. Germany then bypassed the Maginot Line through Belgium and the Ardennes. The fortress belt Gustav had been ordered to smash had already been outmaneuvered before the gun was ready. So the cannon went east instead. Its original target had vanished, but the weapon remained. And by the time it reached Crimea, the question was no longer whether Germany could assemble it. The harder question was why a machine built on this scale had still not produced a decisive result. Sevastopol offered the kind of target that seemed to justify it. This was not open country with columns exposed on roads. It was a fortress landscape of buried concrete, rock, naval batteries, underground depots, and defensive positions built to survive ordinary bombardment. Gustav was aimed at places that standard artillery could damage only slowly or not at all. High-explosive projectile weighed about 4,800 kilograms, which meant each round demanded machinery to move and time to load. Destructive power came at the cost of tempo. The concrete-piercing shell reached roughly 7,100 to 7,500 kilograms, heavy enough to threaten buried targets, but also heavy enough to slow every firing cycle. The gun itself weighed about 1,344 tons, a figure that translated directly into rail stress, site preparation, and near-impossible concealment. With the high-explosive round, maximum range was commonly given as 47 kilometers, enough to strike deep into the fortress zone, but not enough to free it from the geography of rails and reconnaissance. Numbers mattered here because each one created a weakness as well as a threat. Loading was not the work of a gun crew in the ordinary sense. Cranes had to lift shells into place. Specialized cars brought ammunition. Engineers maintained the track bed in alignment. Guards protected the site. Camouflage and air defense had to be planned around a target too large to disappear once discovered. The more force Gustav could deliver onto a distant bunker, the more infrastructure it concentrated in one place for the enemy to find. Then came the shot. The barrel rose, the rail carriage held. A shell weighing several tons entered the chamber, and the entire system became a machine for driving explosive force through earth and reinforced concrete. Accounts from the siege credit Gustav with hitting fortifications and batteries around Sevastopol. One of the most dramatic reports placed a shell near Severnaya Bay, where it drove through layers of soil, rock, and reinforced concrete before exploding inside an ammunition magazine. If that report is accurate, the effect was terrifying. A depot thought safe from ordinary fire could be reached from outside the fortress by a single projectile. Ground and concrete no longer guaranteed protection. But after that revelation, another danger emerged. A weapon this large could not exploit surprise for long. The rail lines, the support trains, the cranes, the gun pit, and the security perimeter were not just logistics, they were signals. Every day spent preparing to fire gave Soviet observers more chances to identify where the strike was coming from. Once fixed by reconnaissance, Gustav was tied to a narrow set of tracks and could not quickly relocate if the front shifted, if counter-battery fire improved, or if air attack threatened the site. What made it formidable against fortifications also made it vulnerable to changing conditions around the fortress. This was the cannon that turned deployment into intelligence. By the middle of the siege, Gustav had fired massive shells against Soviet positions, but the effect remained difficult to measure against the effort required to keep it in action. A destroyed target could be counted. So could the labor, rail work, ammunition handling, guard force, and time invested before each salvo. Harder to measure was how much of that damage might have been achieved by smaller artillery used in greater volume, from more positions, with less warning to the enemy. That distinction mattered because the gun's reputation expanded faster than its campaign value. Penetration of concrete did not become strategic leverage by itself. Siege warfare still depended on sustained pressure, movement of supplies, repair of damage, coordination of assaults, and the ability to keep striking as conditions changed. Gustav broke hardened points, but its own bulk slowed the system that was supposed to profit from those breaks. A normal battery could shift position with the front. Gustav needed prepared rail. A normal artillery group could disperse under threat. Gustav concentrated men, ammunition, machinery, and command attention into one oversized signature. Once emplaced, it was powerful in the direction of the target and constrained in almost every other direction. Later judgments attributed to German commanders were sharply critical. the combat effect did not justify the industrial effort and manpower required to deploy it. The weapon had proved that it could penetrate defenses. It had also proved that spectacular penetration was not the same thing as operational freedom. Its first mission had vanished on the French frontier. Its second mission in Crimea turned it into a siege instrument whose presence could be read from its rails, whose firing position had to be protected like a fixed installation, and whose value shrank whenever the battlefield stopped behaving like a static target range. By the end, the most frightening fact was not only the 800mm bore, the 7,500-kilogram bunker shell, or the claimed explosion beneath Severnaya Bay. It was the problem that followed every shot. A weapon this large could not be whisked away, hidden in a woodline, or easily destroyed before capture. If the front bent the wrong way, the gun itself could become the next fortress on the map, immobile, obvious, and waiting for the enemy to arrive first. Number 9. The underground gun aimed at London. The buried cannon built to make London wait for the next impact. After the railway gun whose size betrayed it before it fired, German engineers tried the opposite. They wanted a weapon that could vanish into the landscape and keep firing from a place reconnaissance might mistake for geology. In 1943, at Landreton-le-Nord in northern France, workers began cutting into a chalk hillside near Mimoyec. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary slope in occupied territory. Inside, it was becoming a fixed artillery battery aimed across the English Channel. The first mystery was not what the hill could fire, it was why the Allies attacked that particular hill so heavily. Reconnaissance photographs showed scars of excavation, rail links, concrete work, and angled shafts cut into the slope. Intelligence feared something worse than a bunker or storage depot. A permanent, long-range weapon whose barrels were being embedded in chalk so that only the support system might ever be seen from the air. The answer lay beneath layers of chalk, concrete, shafts, galleries, and rail tunnels. The Germans were building the V3, a long-range gun unlike the V1 flying bomb or the V2 rocket. Those weapons arrived, struck, and vanished. The V3 was meant to remain in place and keep sending shells at the same city. Its barrels did not rely on one enormous charge behind the shell. They were designed as long tubes with extra propellant chambers opening along their length. As the projectile moved forward, the side charges would ignite in sequence and add speed again and again. The gun would grow more powerful as the shell traveled. Planned installation was described as a 25-barrel battery. If completed, it could send repeated shells toward London from a concealed position in northern France. No launch vehicle crossing the sky. No mobile convoy crawling along a road. No single flash revealing the entire mechanism. The frightening part was not one shell. It was the possibility of the next one arriving before London had finished reacting to the first. The design was also dangerously demanding. Every chamber had to fire at the right moment and in the right sequence. A mistake could destroy the barrel or break the projectile apart. The V3 depended on timing, and that timing left little room for error. But that fragility did not make the site safe to ignore. It made the Allied problem worse. If the surface buildings were only support structures, then damaging what aircraft could see might still leave the firing system recoverable below. A partial raid could buy Germany repair time instead of preventing bombardment. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence had identified Mimoyec as part of the German long-range weapons threat. Analysts compared photographs, construction patterns, and intercepted fears about weapons directed at Britain. Bombers were sent against a target that did not resemble a normal military installation because failure meant more than one missed objective. It meant leaving London under the threat of a weapon that might not need to move, reload in the open, or expose itself before firing again. There was no visible battery to burn, no tower to collapse. What reconnaissance saw was a hillside under construction. What intelligence feared was a machine already taking shape behind it. The Allies escalated. On July 6, 1944, RAF No. 617 Squadron struck Mimoyec. The date mattered because the invasion of France had begun a month earlier, but London was still under threat from long-range attack across the Channel. If ordinary bombing only cratered the slope and left the galleries usable, the site could survive long enough to matter. That is why Leonard Cheshire's squadron was sent with Barnes-Wallace's Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound bomb weighing about 5,400 kilograms. The Tall Boy was not chosen simply for size. It was built to drive deep into earth and concrete before detonating, so that shock would break what could not be reached directly from the air. The strike ruptured shafts and damaged underground works, but it also revealed the central problem. Surface attack alone might not be enough. The chalk absorbed, buried, and concealed damage unevenly. A target could be hit hard and still remain difficult to assess. The Allies were no longer just bombing a site. They were trying to collapse a buried firing system before Germany could finish or repair it. The campaign against Mimoyek continued under that pressure. On August 12, 1944, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. took part in a secret American mission connected to attacks on hardened German weapon sites. The aircraft was packed with explosives. After the crew escaped, it was supposed to be guided remotely toward its target. It was an early form of drone warfare, developed because ordinary bombing had struggled against concrete protected targets. The fact carried its own warning. If tall boys represented escalation, remotely guided explosive aircraft showed that even escalation might not be enough against the hardest V-weapon sites. Kennedy never made it out. The explosive-filled aircraft detonated prematurely over England, killing him and his co-pilot. The mission was part of Operation Aphrodite, with preparations linked to targets including German V-weapon installations. The buried gun in France had already forced the Allies into riskier methods, and those methods were now killing airmen before they ever reached the enemy. Mimoyek never became the fully operational London gun the Allies feared. The site was damaged before the planned battery could deliver its intended rate of fire. The technology also remained unreliable, and accounts still disagree over how close the V3 came to practical use. Some versions of the story portray London as narrowly escaping a finished superweapon. Others describe a vast construction effort that could never have done what its designers promised. Both details matter. A weapon can be dangerous before it is ready. Its existence can redirect aircraft, intelligence work, engineering, and lives. It does not have to fire successfully to alter the war around it. Beneath the chalk, the Allies were not hitting an empty worksite. They were trying to break a concealed firing machine with underground barrels, sequential charges, and a planned battery of 25 guns aimed at London. After the tall boys struck, the galleries went quiet. Rail tunnels ended in darkness. Concrete chambers stood unfinished. The next impact London had been waiting for never came from Mimoyek. Lesson did. If one buried gun site could force heavier bombs, secret drone missions, and intelligence panic before it ever fired properly, then destroying Mimoyek did not end the problem. It proved that the next weapon might be hidden even better, and that the Allies might have to discover it only after the first rounds arrived. Number 8. The rocket fighter that ate its pilots. On August 16, 1944, near Brandis outside Leipzig, men on the ground waited for an aircraft they feared even after it had survived the enemy. They watched the horizon for a tiny, tailless shape coming home dead stick, wheels already gone, fuel still inside. The most dangerous moment might begin when it touched down. In the air, the pilot had seconds to attack. On the ground, the crew had to decide how close they dared to go. The fighter that reached the future before pilots were ready to survive it. That morning belonged to Jagdgeschwader 400, the Luftwaffe's rocket interceptor unit, formed under Major Wolfgang Später and built for one desperate purpose: climb into American bomber streams so fast that escort fighters could barely react, strike once, and return before the window closed. The machine was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet, the only rocket-propelled interceptor ever used operationally in combat. It was not a conventional fighter with a better engine. It was a rocket with a cockpit and two 30mm cannon. Später understood the seduction immediately. Allied bombers were arriving in hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 aircraft in a day. Germany needed something that could rise almost vertically into their path. The Komet looked like the answer. It could accelerate into a different category of speed from the propeller fighters of the time, Slash upward, fire, and be gone. That promise came with a design so extreme that it changed the meaning of a sortie. A pilot did not roll down the runway on a normal undercarriage. He took off on a wheeled trolley. Once airborne, the trolley dropped away. Under him remained only a landing skid for the return. The aircraft began its mission by shedding the gear it needed to land properly. Every kilogram mattered when the airplane was trying to become a guided explosion pointed at a bomber formation. Inside the fuselage sat the real threat. The engine drank two propellants that did not forgive mistakes. T-Stoff, the oxidizer, was 80% hydrogen peroxide. C-Stoff, the fuel, included 30% hydrazine hydrate in methyl alcohol. Separate, they were already dangerous enough to require protective gear. Mixed by a leak, contamination, or impact, they could ignite with almost no warning. The pilot sat between them. You are climbing through cloud in an aircraft that feels less flown than launched. The burn is violent and brief. The bomber stream appears ahead, silver and dense, but the closure rate is wrong for a man trained on ordinary fighters. You do not ease into firing position. You arrive in it and lose it almost at once. That was the Komet's central madness. Its genius created its flaw. It was so fast that aiming could become the hardest part of the mission. A pilot had only seconds to line up a B-17 or B-24 before overshooting. Then the fuel was going. Then the power was gone. The miracle interceptor became a glider descending toward Germany, with no second pass unless geometry and luck offered one. Luck was not a planning method. By the end of the war, 279 Me-163B aircraft had been delivered. The Luftwaffe imagined small, dispersed Komet units springing up to hit Allied bomber formations wherever they appeared. On paper, it looked like a hidden answer to strategic bombing. Practice, the scores stayed murky and small. JG-400 is commonly credited with only about 9 confirmed victories, while crashes, accidents, and operational losses consumed more of the program than combat success did. The exact totals remain disputed, because wartime claims and post-war accounting do not line up cleanly. The imbalance is clear enough. The Komet terrified everyone who saw it. It did not destroy enough to justify what it cost. Some hidden weapons disappear because they fail in public. Others almost work, but in ways too strange to fit the war around them. The Me-163 sat between those outcomes. It could do something real. Allied pilots had never seen anything quite like a fighter that shot upward on rocket power and then vanished through a formation. Every advantage came attached to an operating cycle that bordered on suicidal. Return to Brandis, to the men waiting on the runway edge. Why did ground crews fear a landed aircraft? Landing was not the safe part. It was where all the design compromises came due at once. The Komet came back powerless, gliding toward base on a skid instead of wheels. Escort fighters learned to stalk its descent because they knew it could not evade after burnout. If the approach was bad, the field rough, or the skid hit hard, the impact could rupture the tanks. If fuel and oxidizer escaped and met, the machine could become a chemical blast site beneath the pilot and directly in front of the men running to pull him clear. The hazard was intimate. T-Stoff could burn through organic material. C-Stoff was no kinder. Crews had to fuel and service the aircraft with obsessive separation. Residue in the wrong place could start the reaction. A fighter returning from combat was not just damaged metal to inspect. It was a loaded system of corrosive chemicals, stressed tanks, hotlines, and a pilot trapped in the middle of it, waiting for the skid to stop scraping. The Komet's paradox waited at the end of the runway. Germany had built a fighter that could reach the bomber stream like a glimpse of the jet age. But for most of each mission, it was either an unstable rocket or a helpless glider. The enemy learned when to catch it. Its own crews learned when not to touch it. At Brandis, after the attack run, one of those little tailless aircraft drops lower over the field, nose up, silent now. The skid hits. The fuselage slams and slides. Groundmen start forward, then stop. If the tanks have split open, the first thing to reach the pilot will not be the rescue crew. Number 7. The flying bomb with a pilot on top. Which aircraft is the weapon, the fighter sitting on top or the bomber carrying it? In July 1943, German engineers tested a machine that made the question brutally simple. A Focke-Wulf fighter was mounted above a stripped Junkers Ju-88 bomber. The upper aircraft carried the pilot, the lower one carried the explosives. Together, they looked less like an airplane than a parasite with wings. The Ju-88 had started life as a conventional bomber, with a cockpit, crew stations, and the equipment needed to bring it home. Engineers removed those parts. In their place, they installed a shaped charge warhead weighing as much as 3,500 kilograms, about 7,715 pounds. The explosive mixture was described as 70% hexagen and 30% TNT. That number mattered because a near miss was almost the same as failure. The charge was meant to break what ordinary bombing often only damaged: a bridge span, a lock gate, a ship in harbor, a hardened installation. If it hit wrong, several tons of explosive could tear up earth, water, and concrete edges, throw blast and overpressure across the target area, and still leave the bridge standing. One mistake could spend an entire aircraft on a crater. The bomber was no longer expected to survive the mission. It did not need a crew. It did not need landing gear that worked afterward. It only needed to fly straight for a few more minutes. That requirement sounds simple on paper. In the air, it made every stage unstable. The fighter pilot took off with the entire stack beneath him. The controls were awkward from the first roll. Composite aircraft was heavy, ungainly, and difficult to handle. And if it swerved, bounced, or lost an engine at the wrong moment, the pilot was not just aborting a mission. He was trying to drag a bomber-sized warhead off the runway without tearing the pair apart. After takeoff, there was no comfort in altitude. The fighter above and bomber below were joined by struts and braces, forced to behave like one body. The pilot had to feel through the controls what he could not see clearly beneath him. Whether the lower aircraft was still tracking cleanly, whether the assembly was climbing symmetrically, whether vibration, drag, or a mechanical fault was building toward a release that might happen too early, too late, or not at all. The pilot was not meant to die. That separated the design from a conventional suicide aircraft. He rode the weapon toward the target, then escaped in the fighter. The aircraft beneath him was the sacrifice. But that promise of escape depended on one clean moment, and the closer he came to the target, the less room there was for error. Later Mistel combinations paired fighters such as the FW190 or BF109 with a Ju-88 below. But the pilot did not experience them as tidy designations. He experienced them as weight, drag, and timing. He had to bring a misshapen two-aircraft structure across a front increasingly watched by Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns, often at low altitude, where every course correction ate distance and every evasive move threatened aim. Approach was the worst part. Then the target had to be identified, lined up, and judged not as a point on a map, but as an object growing in the windscreen. A bridge crossing, a ship in anchorage, a power installation, an invasion harbor. The pilot had to calculate distance and angle while knowing that release too early would waste the strike, and release too late might leave him inside the blast zone or too tangled to break away. For a few seconds after separation, the bomber continued forward by itself. No crew in the cockpit, no one aboard to correct the aim, just a huge, aircraft-sized charge descending towards steel, masonry, or water. If the release failed, the fighter remained attached to a machine that was never meant to come back. If the release worked, but the lower aircraft yawed, drifted, or dropped short, the pilot had thrown away the entire mission in an instant. If Allied fighters appeared during the approach, he had to choose between defending himself and preserving the line of attack. The weapon was only terrifying if it arrived straight. German planners wanted that terror directed at targets ordinary bombs could not easily erase: ships in protected anchorages, bridges over major rivers, power stations, and infrastructure supporting invasion. Operations were considered against places such as Scapa Flow, but the strategic problem kept worsening. The composite aircraft needed time, altitude, fuel, working mechanisms, and a route through a sky that Allied air superiority was steadily closing. That was the trap built into the idea. The larger the target's importance, the more likely it was to be defended. The more carefully the pilot approached, the longer he remained exposed. Lower Ju-88 was the explosive, but the upper fighter was still a vulnerable man flying directly into the densest part of the danger. By 1944 and 1945, Mistel aircraft were being tested and used with the Luftwaffe's Special Operations formations under the codename Beethoven, a name far calmer than the experience it described. Reports from the last months of the war suggest launches against Soviet bridge crossings on the Oder, including an account that several were sent out near Kustrin in late April 1945. Only a fraction were said to have released release position. That uncertainty is part of the story. Late-war Germany could still assemble spectacular weapons, but not the stable airspace or reliable execution those weapons required. The Mistel did not change the war. It arrived too late, too fragile, and in numbers too small. What it revealed was something colder. A bomber could be emptied of crew, packed with 7,715 pounds of explosive, and reduced to a guided battering ram controlled from another aircraft for the last miles of its life. Success demanded a perfect takeoff, a stable climb, an undetected approach, a precise release, and an escape timed to seconds. Failure could happen at any one of those points, and by 1945, almost all of them were waiting. At the end of the run, the upper aircraft pulled away if it could. The lower, Ju-88, did not continue as a damaged bomber. It went on alone as the warhead, and if it missed the bridge by even a little, the target survived, the aircraft was gone, and the pilot had to fly home knowing the next approach would have to be made through an even tighter sky. Number 6. The Cherry Blossom Bomb. The missile with a cockpit. On April 12, 1945, Lieutenant Commander William D. Brown was watching the radar screen aboard USS Manard L. Abel, a destroyer stationed northeast of Okinawa. The ship was one of the exposed pickets pushed ahead of the fleet. The first warning of a Japanese air attack could appear as a blip in the dark. That afternoon, the warning became real. A Japanese aircraft struck near the after engine room and badly damaged the destroyer. Smoke spread across the deck. Men fought to keep the ship alive. About a minute later, another shape came in low over the water. It was smaller than a bomber and too fast for a normal aircraft. Something else was wrong. It had a cockpit. The weapon was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. The bomber brought it close to the fleet, released it, and left the pilot inside to take over. That made the Oka difficult to classify. It looked like an aircraft, but it was never meant to return. A 2,646-pound warhead filled its nose, enough explosive to turn a destroyer-sized hull into a structural failure rather than merely a damaged ship. The pilot was not flying toward a target and planning an escape route. He was the guidance system. The Oka entered level flight at roughly 650 kilometers per hour, already fast enough to compress the time available for lookouts, gunners, and fire control crews. In its final dive, reported speeds reached between 930 and 1,000 kilometers per hour. At that speed, a ship could be detected only moments before impact, while tracking corrections and firing solutions became increasingly unreliable. The weapon had a weakness before it reached that final dive. The Oka had short range. It could not cross the ocean alone. The slow, vulnerable Betty bomber had to carry it near the target through radar-directed fighters and anti-aircraft fire. American forces did not need to destroy every Oka. They needed to destroy the bomber before it reached launch position. The first operational Oka mission, on March 21st, failed at that stage. The carrier bombers were intercepted. The missile never reached the fleet. The weapon was nearly unstoppable after release, but the entire attack could still be defeated by killing the slow Betty before that moment. For the crew of the Abele, that distinction vanished in seconds. The Oka came in at the waterline and struck the destroyer's midsection. Its warhead detonated inside the ship. The center of the vessel disintegrated. The destroyer broke apart and sank quickly. USS Manard L. Abele became the first American warship sunk by an Oka. The attack exposed the weapon's operating logic. It did not need to survive a battle or carry fuel for a return flight. It needed one clear approach, one pilot willing to remain inside the aircraft, and one moment when the ship's defenses failed. That changed the mission of every radar picket crew. A distant contact was no longer simply an incoming aircraft to be reported and engaged. It might be the carrier of a weapon that would not become dangerous until the last possible moment. Once the Betty reached release range, a destroyer's layered defenses could be bypassed by a single, fast, low approach. The crew had to win the race against the bomber before the Oka was even visible. And even created training versions, including the MXY-7-K1, with a landing skid and flaps. Pilots practiced in an aircraft designed to end in impact. The program became industrial, technical, and bureaucratic. Suicide had been given a model number. The weapon's effectiveness still depended on the aircraft carrying it. Many Okas never left their bombers. Others never found a target. Their dramatic final attack was only the last link in a chain that could break during takeoff, approach, interception, or release. Was the Oka a successful weapon, or a terrifying weapon that rarely got the chance to work? The wreck of the Abele provides the answer. Its success was not measured by the number of launches. It was measured by what happened when one missile arrived. A destroyer built to fight aircraft was struck by an aircraft that had surrendered everything except its final dive. The explosion did not merely damage the ship, it erased the space where the ship had been. And that left the surviving ships with a new fear. They could not wait to identify the weapon in its cockpit or measure the speed of its dive. The decisive threat was already approaching behind it. The Betty bomber that might release it. Number 5. The bombs that crossed an ocean. On May 5, 1945, searchers in the woods near Bly, Oregon found torn paper, bits of rigging, and metal fragments scattered across the ground. There was no crater from an air raid, no wrecked plane, no pilot. Just pieces in an American forest, as if the weapon had arrived without a machine to carry it. It was the secret attack that arrived with the weather report. Start with the distance. More than 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. No bomber escort, no submarine deck gun, no landing force. Just a hydrogen balloon launched from Japan and handed off to the winter wind. From November 1944 to April 1945, Japan sent about 9,000 of them east toward North America. The plan relied on the jet stream to do what Japan's shrinking air and naval power no longer could. The balloons traveled at around 30,000 feet, high enough to be difficult to see, and could cross the ocean in roughly 30 to 60 hours, without active control once they were launched. The weapon looked cheap and improvised. It was built largely of paper. Its route depended on one of the fastest rivers of air on Earth. The explosives were real. A typical Fugo could carry one 15-kilogram anti-personnel bomb and incendiaries weighing about 12 kilograms. The key engineering sat above the payload, in the atmosphere. Japanese planners were exploiting the high-altitude Pacific jet stream, a weather system studied before the war by meteorologist Wasaburo Oishi. This was not a random stunt. It was an intercontinental delivery system built from paper, hydrogen, ballast, and timing. Not a bomber, not a missile. A weather weapon with bombs underneath. Distinction shaped the problem American officials faced. The Fugo was crude, unreliable, and strategically limited, but it was not stupid. It worked often enough to create a problem no radar plot explained. American officials began receiving reports from the West Coast and inland regions, sightings, fragments, occasional fires, unexplained debris. They tried to keep the reports out of the press. The blackout was tactical. If newspapers across the United States printed stories about mysterious balloons, fires, and casualties, Japanese commanders would learn that at least some balloons were arriving. If the reports stayed quiet, Tokyo might conclude that the campaign was accomplishing nothing and stop launching them. But the silence created a second danger. It denied Tokyo the results it needed to adjust the campaign, while leaving Americans in remote areas unaware that strange debris could be deadly. About 9,000 balloons crossed the ocean, but almost none made the news. Many fell into water, mountains, or empty land. Others landed in damp winter terrain where the incendiaries performed badly. The campaign was seasonal and wildly imprecise, yet even a tiny success rate could leave lethal debris far from any battlefield. On the morning of May 5th, Reverend Archie Mitchell drove into the woods with his pregnant wife, Elsie Mitchell, and 5 Sunday school children for a picnic near Gearhart Mountain. While he parked the car, Elsie and the children walked ahead. They found something strange on the ground. Not an aircraft, not an artillery shell. An object in the forest that did not belong there. A moment later, it exploded. 6 civilians were killed, Elsie Mitchell and the 5 children with her. It remains the only known fatal enemy attack on the continental United States during the Second World War. The statistic is shocking because of the delivery system. After Pearl Harbor, submarine attacks, carrier warfare, and strategic bombing, the deadliest direct enemy strike on the continental United States came from a balloon. It crossed an ocean largely unattended, riding the wind at 30,000 feet where few people could see it. After 30 to 60 hours without a pilot or active control, it dropped into a forest where the war must have seemed impossibly far away. The Fugo campaign failed as a strategic operation. It never delivered the fires and panic Japan wanted. It did not force the United States to divert huge resources, halt production, or alter the course of the Pacific War. By the spring of 1945, Japan was already collapsing under pressure far greater than any balloon offensive could create. But failure did not make the attack meaningless. American censorship denied Tokyo the feedback every long-range operation depends on, while the same silence prevented civilians from learning what not to touch. The decision protected military intelligence and public morale, yet it also left the next person who found a torn envelope or metal fitting to make the first move without warning. Fragments in Oregon make the weapon easier to understand through consequences. 6,000 miles meant an attack could cross an ocean without a fleet. 30,000 feet made it hard to detect. 30 to 60 hours meant no one could correct its course. And 9,000 launches meant that even a tiny success rate could scatter lethal debris across a continent. Then came one picnic in May 1945. A minister stepped away to park the car. 6 civilians reached the weapon before any soldier did. Officially, the campaign produced little military value. In the woods near Bly, the torn paper and metal on the ground recorded something narrower and harder to dismiss. The fragments had come all the way from Japan. And the silence that saved lives by hiding the results also left other civilians unaware that the next strange object in the forest might be waiting to kill them. Number 4. The island that planned a plague. The story moves from a weapon carried by weather to one that could have turned weather, grass, milk, and meat into accomplices. In March 1968, members of Parliament were still asking why a small island off Scotland's northwest coast remained closed. Warning signs marked it. Its soil was treated as if the war had never ended. Grenard Island sits at 57 degrees 56 minutes north, 5 degrees 35 minutes west, a dark shape in Grenard Bay. No town, no fortress, no remembered battle. For decades, people were told to stay away. The paper trail begins in 1942, not on the island, but at Porton Down near Salisbury, Britain's secret biological warfare center. Microbiologist Paul Fields headed the biology department. London feared that Nazi Germany might add disease to its arsenal of bombs and gas. Britain began drafting an answer. It was not aimed at trenches or warships. It was aimed at pasture. The plan became known as Operation Vegetarian, a name so mild it almost concealed its purpose. Small linseed cattle cakes would be loaded with anthrax spores and dropped by the Royal Air Force over German grazing land. Cattle would eat them first and die of anthrax. Herds would be destroyed. Meat and dairy products would become contaminated. Food supplies would collapse. Human infection could follow hunger. The weapon needed no dramatic explosion. Before it began working, it could look like ordinary animal feed. British planners needed proof, so they went to an island. In 1942, Grenard became a field laboratory. Sheep were tethered downwind. Anthrax munitions were detonated. The setup sounds clinical on paper. The result was not abstract. In days, the sheep were dead. The tests confirmed what Fields and Portendown needed to know. Anthrax could kill efficiently in open conditions beyond the laboratory. The island also answered a question nobody wanted to face. Anthrax was not merely lethal. It lingered. The spores remained in the soil. Weather did not burn them away. Sea air did not dissolve them. The test site became evidence that this was not simply an attack plan. It was a land denial plan with no clean endpoint. By 1944, Britain intended Operation Vegetarian to be ready for use against Germany. Sources differ on how strictly the plan was framed as retaliation, but the production numbers are clear. By the end of the war, around 5 million anthrax-laced cattle cakes had been manufactured. 5 million cakes. Not a sketch in a file, not a laboratory curiosity. An industrial quantity, prepared for a campaign in which cows would be the first victims and civilians the final target. The numbers tell the story. One island, a handful of test animals, wartime trials in 1942. The contamination outlived Hitler, rationing, and the war that had justified it. Grunard acquired a new name, Anthrax Island. It remained off-limits for decades because the spores stayed viable in the ground. The war could end while the field remained dangerous. In 1986, British scientists began a full decontamination effort. They used formaldehyde diluted in seawater and pumped it across the contaminated soil. That was 44 years after the original trials. 4 decades passed before Britain began cleaning up a test of a weapon that had never been used in combat. The island was declared safe in 1990. 48 years had passed. The secret project had become history, and history had become a warning sign standing in the rain. The documents show how the plan tightened. A government feared biological attack and prepared a deterrent. The deterrent required testing. The test proved the weapon worked, but it also turned the test site into poisoned evidence of how well it worked. Once disease became a munition, the battlefield no longer ended where the soldiers stopped. The code name carries a cruel irony. Vegetarian suggests restraint, cleanliness, refusal. The plan did not spare flesh. It used feed to enter the body through the oldest route possible, eating. No mushroom cloud, no siren. Cattle lowered their heads into grass while the food system began to rot from the inside. Grunard remained off-limits because Britain tested anthrax on tethered sheep there in 1942. The island stayed contaminated until 1990, quarantined for nearly half a century by a weapon designed to make the harvest itself lethal. Number 3. The Laboratory War. The weapons lab whose victims were treated as data. In October 1940, Japanese aircraft lifted off from occupied Hangzhou and flew toward Ningbo, a port city on China's Zhejiang coast. They were not carrying bombs for a bridge or shells for a factory. Their cargo was smaller: grain, cotton scraps, sand, and fleas infected with plague bacteria. The target was the Kaiming Street area. From the ground, the attack could have looked almost absurd. A few aircraft, no towering explosions, no crater to mark what had happened. Material drifted down over a civilian neighborhood, carrying an organism that could move from flea to rat, from rat to human, and from one household to the next. This was the weapon, not a projectile, but an ecological chain. Behind it stood Unit 731, Japan's military biological warfare program, commanded by Army Surgeon Shiro Ishii. In 1936, the unit was formally established by imperial order. By 1938, its main complex had moved to Pingfang, about 33 kilometers south of Harbin. The distance mattered, close enough to a major city for transport and supply, far enough to conceal a sealed industrial world of laboratories, animal facilities, prison cells, and execution rooms. Its language was clinical. Specimens, experiments, results. The people inside were prisoners. At Pingfang, human beings were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, typhus, glanders, dysentery, and other diseases. Some were dissected while alive. Others were exposed to freezing temperatures, pressure changes, or weapons injuries, so researchers could record what happened to the body. But the laboratory was only half of the program. The other half was delivery. Unit 731 studied how disease could survive outside the body. It studied how infected fleas could be transported, how rats could carry outbreaks into populated areas, and how contaminated wells, food, and movement could spread illness beyond the original strike. The weapon did not need to hit a soldier. It needed to enter a town. Ningbo showed that shift. The program moved from controlled experimentation to operational attack. After the October raid, biological operations were linked to other locations in Zhejiang, including Jinhua and Chuzhou, and to Chengde in 1941. The precise death toll remains disputed. Wartime records were destroyed or never created. Epidemics blurred into famine, displacement, and ordinary military violence. Some deaths can be documented. Others disappeared into the outbreak itself. The evidence is real, but it does not sit in one clean file. Chinese survivors and local records described outbreaks and attacks. Japanese personnel later gave testimony, sometimes decades after the events. Soviet authorities prosecuted 12 Japanese defendants at Khabarovsk in December 1949 for manufacturing and using bacteriological weapons. Yet the Khabarovsk record did not settle the matter. It created a public record while leaving the most powerful investigators with private access to the men who had built the program. That access changed the stakes. In April 1947, U.S. investigator Norbert Fell led a mission in Japan that became part of the American evaluation of Unit 731's data. In interrogation rooms, American occupation officials questioned Ishii and other personnel about methods, results, and command links. They were not merely collecting names for indictments. They were testing whether the experiments could answer a new Cold War problem: how to design, deliver, and measure biological weapons against an enemy population. A memo could therefore turn a murder into an intelligence asset. If the testimony went to prosecutors, it might establish crimes. If it went to military scientists, it might improve American preparedness or offensive capability. The choice did not erase the evidence. It changed who controlled it and what consequences followed. Declassified post-war records show officials weighing the intelligence value of the data against the value of prosecution. The United States gained access to human experimentation records unavailable through ordinary military research. Prosecutors lost the chance to place many of the program's architects under oath in open court. That trade-off helps explain why the truth emerged in fragments. The Soviet trial placed some facts in public view, but many Japanese personnel avoided prosecution. Ishii himself was never tried by the United States. The program's survivors entered the post-war world carrying knowledge that powerful governments had decided might be more valuable than a courtroom. The concealment did not stop at the laboratory. It followed the weapon into the archive. A report could list pathogens like inventory. A transcript could call prisoners subjects. A file could preserve technical findings while stripping away the names of the dead. On the ground in Ningbo, it looked different. Fleas fell through the air. Rats moved through streets. Families walked into an invisible battlefield without knowing that a laboratory had chosen them. The number of civilians who died from Unit 731-linked attacks remains unresolved because an outbreak was easier to hide than a bomb. A bomb leaves a hole. Disease leaves arguments over cause, timing, and responsibility. Those arguments became a second shield, first against wartime accountability, then against scrutiny of the biological programs that inherited the data. Part of the pattern is clear. The weapon was hidden first as a military secret, then as a political liability. It had not failed in the way officials later implied. It had shown that a battlefield could be manufactured inside a civilian population, and that the resulting knowledge could cross into a new arms race without the victims crossing into court. After 1945, Shiro Ishii was not standing before a judge. He was being questioned by officials deciding what his knowledge was worth. The laboratory was officially treated as a source of data. Its most valuable records were the ones least likely to be read aloud in court. And the unanswered question was no longer only what Unit 731 had done, but which later programs learned from the files kept out of reach. Number 2. The gas even Hitler did not release. What if the most frightening weapon in a collapsing war is the one no one fires? On December 23, 1936, at an IG Farben laboratory in Leverkusen, chemist Gerhard Schrader leaned over a line of compounds designed to kill insects, not armies. The liquid he and his team produced was so toxic that a tiny exposure nearly poisoned the room. Within weeks, the discovery had left the laboratory and reached German military authorities. It would be named Tabun. 2 years later, in 1938, Schrader's group at Wuppertal-Elberfeld produced something worse: sarin. Another clear liquid. Another breakthrough no one had been seeking in public. By the time Europe went to war, Germany possessed a chemical advantage so severe that even the Allies did not fully understand it. The weapon existed. The stockpiles existed. The shells existed. The order never came. The invisible weapon kept in reserve by a regime with almost no reserves left. The path from accident to arsenal was brutally efficient. Schrader was not a lone chemist working in a back room. He belonged to IG Farben, one of the largest industrial systems in Europe. The state knew what his team had found. Not mustard gas, not chlorine. Something new. A nerve agent. A poison that attacked the body's signaling system, shutting down muscles, lungs, sight, and movement. The victim could remain conscious while the body lost the ability to obey. That distinction mattered. Armies already had masks, doctrine, and memories from the First World War. Tabun belonged to a different category of terror. It was not merely another cloud drifting over trenches. It would be loaded into bombs and shells, stored, transported, and prepared through an industrial chain. Germany built that chain. In 1940, construction began at Diehenfurt an der Oder in Silesia, today Brzeg Dolny in Poland. The site's code name was Hochwerk. The name sounded bureaucratic, almost harmless. The reality was a sealed production complex built for the mass manufacture of Tabun under extreme secrecy. The plant was Army-owned, operated through the IG Farben subsidiary Anorgana GmbH, and worked with forced labor. The story had moved beyond discovery. Germany now had documented production capability. From 1942 to 1945, Tabun was produced there in quantity, not kilograms, not laboratory vials. The most often cited estimate is about 12,000 metric tons. 12,000 tons of a nerve agent that Allied forces did not properly grasp in real time. Germany also prepared sarin production, although those facilities were still being readied as the war closed in. The hidden system included bunkers, fences, code names, guarded rail lines, and something less visible: a vast gap in understanding. German leaders seem to have assumed that their enemies had discovered similar compounds. They had not. Picture Europe in 1944. Germany is being bombed day and night. Soviet armies are driving west. Allied forces have returned to the continent. Fuel is short. Air superiority is gone. Cities are burning. Inside the collapsing machines sit shells and bombs filled with Tabun. They have been produced in secrecy and stored for a moment that never arrives. Why not use them? Part of the answer may begin with memory. Adolf Hitler had been exposed to gas during the First World War, and later accounts often point to that experience. Memory alone, however, is too neat an explanation. Germany's leadership was capable of mass murder on a continental scale. Squeamishness does not account for the silence surrounding these stockpiles. The calculation was colder. Retaliation was one fear. Germany knew that the Allies possessed large chemical arsenals of their own, even if they did not have nerve agents. A Tabun strike on a port, a bridgehead, or a massed army might have triggered waves of mustard gas and other agents against German troops and cities already close to collapse. Commanders would not have needed to understand every molecule. They would have understood the consequence. Open that door, and the war could change shape within hours. Uncertainty created another problem. German officials appear to have believed that the Allies must know what Germany knew. That assumption was wrong, but it still shaped the decision. If you believe the enemy possesses the same invisible weapon, using yours first stops looking like an advantage. It starts looking like permission. The secret concealed Germany's lead from the Allies. It also trapped German decision-makers inside their own worst assumption. Then came the practical danger. Chemical warfare does not stay neatly where it is aimed. Wind shifts, shells break unpredictably, front lines move. Ground contaminated by your own attack may later have to be crossed by your own soldiers. In a war already descending into chaos, nerve agents promised not only slaughter, but contamination, confusion, and command risk. Then, the regime had less and less control over anything. The stockpiles remained real. When Allied forces overran German sites late in the war, they found bombs, artillery shells, documents, and industrial evidence showing that the program had never been fantasy. The horror came from captured munitions and production records, not from rumors whispered after defeat. The weapons had been hidden because they were secret. Secrecy had also distorted everyone's judgment around them. By April 29, 1997, when the Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force, Tabun and sarin would sit on the Schedule 1 list under the OPCW system. They were chemicals so dangerous that, in law, they existed mostly as substances the world agreed should barely exist at all. In the 1940s, that language did not yet exist. There was only capacity, fear, and a hand hovering above an order that never became a signature. Germany possessed a terrifying chemical advantage. It built the plant, filled the weapons, and amassed the poison. The shells stayed silent because retaliation, uncertainty, logistical danger, and hesitation at the top met in the same decision and stopped it. In the depots, the shells waited anyway, sealed in metal, their clear liquid perfectly still. Number 1. The secret that ended one war and started another. On the night of August 5, 1945, on Tinian Island in the Western Pacific, Captain William Deke Parsons climbed into the bomb bay of a B-29 and armed a weapon in flight because no one wanted it fully live during takeoff. Beneath him hung Little Boy, a uranium bomb assembled from work spread across Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, built inside a secret so large that tens of thousands of people served it without fully knowing what they were making. Some refined material, some machined parts, some guarded fences, some moved paperwork from one locked door to another. Very few could see the whole shape. That is where the story turns strange. This was not a hidden cannon rolled into a forest or a toxin sealed in drums under concrete. Beginning in June 1942, the Manhattan Project became a continent-sized machine of secrecy. Entire towns appeared behind badges and barbed wire. Oak Ridge enriched uranium. Hanford bred plutonium. Los Alamos tried to turn theory into a device that would survive assembly, transport, release, descent, and detonation. But the people inside that machine were often handling fragments of a sentence they were not allowed to read. So when Parsons reached into that bomb bay over the Pacific, you were looking at the moment the secret stopped being industrial and became personal. You were there with the metal skin vibrating around you, thousands of feet above open water, inside an aircraft called Enola Gay, next to a weapon no one had ever used in war, and, in Little Boy's case, never fully tested as a nuclear device at all. The design was considered simple enough to trust anyway. Simple meant one mass of uranium-235 fired into another. Simple meant a gun-type mechanism. Simple meant no rehearsal except belief. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Little Boy exploded about 2,000 feet above Hiroshima. The blast did not just destroy a city. It announced that the hidden weapon was real, and it did so in a form almost too abrupt for language. Tens of thousands died immediately. Many more would die later from burns, trauma, and radiation. The evidence was not a test range, not a crater in the desert, not a briefing in Washington. It was Hiroshima itself. But even that was not the full secret. 3 weeks earlier, on July 16th, The Trinity test in New Mexico had already proven a different path to the same abyss. That device used plutonium and implosion, not uranium and a gun barrel arrangement. The difference matters because it means the Manhattan Project had not spent 3 years and unimaginable resources chasing one miracle. It had built two. One design was direct enough to be used without a full-scale nuclear test. The other was so intricate, it required explosive lenses to crush a plutonium core into supercriticality within tiny margins. One was brutal engineering by collision. The other was brutal engineering by precision. And on August 9, 1945, that second design left the runway too. Major Charles Sweeney's B-29 boxcar carried Fat Man toward Japan. The primary target was Kokura, not Nagasaki, but war at that altitude could hinge on weather. Cloud cover and visibility interfered with the run, so the crew turned toward the secondary city. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki. The yield was roughly 20 kilotons, comparable to Hiroshima's, but the weapon was built around a different core and a different mechanism. Two different bomb designs delivered within 3 days meant this was not a one-off prototype. It was a repeatable capability. This is the hidden weapon that made the whole world visible as a target. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no coastline, capital, or industrial center could assume distance was protection. An aircraft no longer needed an army at the gates to threaten a city. A government no longer needed months of warning before its population could be placed at risk. The bomb ended one war, but it also created an immediate problem beyond Japan. The United States now held a nuclear monopoly, and every rival state had to decide whether to accept that imbalance or build its own bomb. The Soviet Union did not need the full Manhattan Project to understand the direction of events. It needed the evidence of two destroyed cities, the knowledge that uranium and plutonium could both be weaponized, and the certainty that the secret could not be put back inside its compartments. Scientists would be recruited, intelligence networks would hunt for designs, factories would be built. The first bomb had been terrifying. The second made an arms race imaginable. That is why the second bombing lands with such force. If Hiroshima demonstrated reality on August 6th, why was Nagasaki hit on August 9th, before the full political and military shock could be measured? The answer remains contested, but the effect is plain. The world did not receive one warning. It received two working data points: uranium and plutonium, gun type and implosion. Secret weapon would have been astonishing. Two made it a system that other governments could copy, improve, multiply, and place under military command. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. The war that had consumed continents moved toward its end. But the hidden part did not end there, because secrecy had concealed more than production. It had concealed scale. You can hide facilities, code names, shipments, scientists, even entire towns for a while. You can tell workers they are helping the war effort and deny them the final sentence. You can break knowledge into compartments and lock each compartment with armed guards. You cannot keep the secret once a city is missing. The Manhattan Project ended as a wartime program, but its consequence had already escaped its creators. Leaders now knew that a single aircraft could erase a city. Rival states knew the method could be reproduced. Military planners knew that future decisions might be made under minutes of warning, with civilians becoming targets before any formal declaration of war. The weapon was no longer hidden. The next secret was who would build it next, how fast they could build it, and whether cities were already hostages before the next war had even begun.